Good day. Welcome to a new series of CAEF web talks on anti-Zionism in the age of wokeism. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of Canadian Antisemitism Education Foundation, or CAEF, or CAEF as some say. Thank you for joining me today, and thanks to our wonderful co-sponsors, whom I'm going to name. End Jew Hatred Canada, the Israel Committee of Sonoma County, the Israel Activist Calendar, Adith Israel Synagogue, the Mattathias Project, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Club Z, North Carolina Coalition for Israel, the Israel Action Coalition of the East Bay, Eye on Antisemitism, Students Supporting Israel, Beth Torah Congregation, Combat Antisemitism Movement, the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, Canada, Lodger Center Congregation, Beth Tikva Synagogue, the Institute for Global Studies in Anti-Semitism and Policy, and SAFE Campus. There can be little doubt that anti-Semitism is the main source of hatred towards Jews in today's version of anti-Semitism. It isn't exactly new, but it has come to a feverish pitch within leftist circles, particularly in academia and the mass media, as well as among leftist politicians. Zionism, the belief in the right of the Jews to reclaim and reconstitute their indigenous homeland, has been excised from this meaning by inverse logic. Israel, as described by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, is the new Jew. Since it isn't fashionable to express anti-Semitism and be outed as a racist or as prejudiced, social justice ideologues have found it convenient in hating Israel to assign every type of crime to that country. The most popular epithets of hatred are found in the oppression diatribe that passes for academia, critical race theory. That blunt instrument serves to divide all peoples into two categories, oppressed and oppressor, and lines up white-skinned people as the latter and people of color as the former. It is no more scientific or appropriate than Hitler's categorizing people as Aryan or non-Aryan. It is anathematological, anti-intellectual, a backhanded way of expressing anti-Semitism, and serves to promote racism rather than any understanding or eradication of it. So how did this bogus, unscientific, belligerent ideology take hold in so many disciplines and in the minds of so many folks in academia? How has it played out? How has it affected academic freedom and the free exchange of ideas? How has it defined Jews, and how have these assumptions and teachings affected our faculty and students? And why have university administrators and governing bodies done so little to address anti-Semitism? Why have funding bodies allowed and tolerated the deluge of lies and bigotry? These are just some of the questions that our two experts will address today. And before I introduce them, please note that the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is a registered charitable organization. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer important webinars and to organize information and advocacy programs in person and online. You can donate online at www.caef.ca, or if you're in the US, you can still go to that site, and your donations will go to the Lawfare Project, which is shown on the site, and donations will be forwarded to assist us in our collaborative initiatives. Today, to participate, you can use the chat to share ideas, but if you'd like questions to be considered, please post them in the Q&A on your screen. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Lax and Cary Kogan, two outstanding individuals who've identified the threats and the danger of anti-Semitism on campus and have done something about it. Anti-Israel protests are a concern across North America. So it's very important that people, academics, are beginning to address this, because it's caused fear among students. And what people haven't recognized is it's also caused enormous anxiety and fear, sometimes, and brought threats to academic faculty as well as administrators who are Jewish. Jeffrey Lax is a professor of law and department chair at the City University of New York, and is co-founder of Students and Faculty for Equality on Campus, or SAEFE, SAFE Campus, a group that advocates for the rights of Zionists and all Jews on college campuses. Professor Lax is an expert on campus anti-Semitism and is a frequent on-air and print contributor on the issues of anti-Semitism. He's appeared in many American news channels and written in many news outlets such as the Jerusalem Post, the New York Post, Allgemeiner, JNS, and the Jewish Press. Cary Kogan is a full professor of clinical psychology at the University of Ottawa and co-chair of the Network of Engaged Canadian Academics, an organization inspired by the US-based nonprofit called Academic Engagement Network, and they share a similar vision. That is to promote academic freedom, freedom of expression, combat anti-Semitism, support research, education, and robust dialogue about Judaism and Israel in the academy, and oppose the denigration of Jewish identity on post-secondary campuses. So I'm welcoming and thanking both of you gentlemen for being here, and I'll invite you, Jeff, to begin the conversation by giving us a bit of a background as to what you're experiencing.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Andrea, for that wonderful introduction, and for you and CAEF hosting this important webinar. I think that if there was ever a time to have both a lawyer and a psychologist on a webinar, this is the time, because people are experiencing so much grief and anger and frustration. So you got the psychologist for that, which I'm thankful for, and you got the lawyer, who no one usually likes, but now we kind of need them. So thank you so much to your group. We know how much you guys do, and we appreciate it. Well, you asked a bunch of million-dollar questions in your opening, and I don't feign to have all the answers to all of them, but I'll start to at least address some of them. And we are starting to, I think, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, get some answers as to what's going on and why it's happening. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But just to go, you asked for a little bit of a background. So yes, I'm the co-founder of a group called Safe Campus, Students and Faculty for Equality on Campus. My group formed because we were seeing, from the inside, on the ground, horrendous anti-Semitism for many years, going back, well before October 7th for sure. And we had been seeing a systemic and a really premeditated anti-Semitism at CUNY, at the university where I work, the City University of New York, which is in a city that's 20% Jewish and is the largest urban university in the United States. And so just to give you a couple of examples that really should shock the conscience, our university was founded in 1961 and has had a long and rich history of Jewish participation, both as students, also as faculty, and also as administrators. And this past year, for the first time, and we put out a report about this, the university's senior leadership, which is 45 senior leaders, has completely expunged all Jews from senior leadership, which is unbelievable statistic. Now, I'm not. We need probably a statistics professor too, Dr. Kogan. I'm not a statistics professor, but I can tell you, it doesn't seem right to me, or statistically possible, that in a 20% Jewish city, you can have 0 of 45 senior leadership that are Jewish by accident. And I can tell you that I know that it wasn't by accident. It was done because of a very misguided DEI policy, where Jews were systemically eliminated, not by accident. And it took, and this is a senior leadership that has had double digits of Jewish administrators for many years, and it took them years to accomplish this goal of making it Judenrein. Now, if that term scares some people, it should. It is scary. You should be scared that a university in the heart of New York City, across New York City, has no Jews in its senior leadership. But it's even worse than that. On top of the 45 senior leaders, we have 25 campus presidents. We have 25 campuses in our university. Also, for the first time since 1961, since we were founded, we have zero Jewish permanent presidents of our campus presidents. Zero. That's unbelievable. And again, historically, we've had a rich tradition of proportional Jewish presidents to the population of New York City. 7, 8, 9 Jewish presidents, and now there are 0. So now you're up to 80 positions at CUNY, the highest, most powerful 80 positions at CUNY, 0 Jews. 0, not 1, 0. How is that possible by accident? It's not. It's purposeful. And again, it took years of nefarious policy to accomplish. Now, we're going to get, I think, today into the reasons behind why this is happening. But you should know that if this is happening at CUNY, and it's only because we have such amazing sources on the ground and embedded across CUNY that we know such things. But this is happening in a lot of universities. They just don't realize it. They don't know about it. So I take great pride in the amazing job that my colleagues in Safe CUNY have done, connecting with resources, connecting with sources who provide us this information. And so we're exposing anti-Semitism on a systemic level and publicly and pervasively in a way that I don't think has ever been done before from the inside. And we have proof of everything. We don't just put stuff out there. We can back everything up with documentation. So it's very scary. And then you look at the systemization of it. And if you look at also what's going on at CUNY, and I strongly believe also that the way the battle against anti-Semitism goes at my university is the way it's going to go across the country and in Canada. Because if you can't fight this battle effectively in New York City, with the largest Jewish population outside of Israel, then how can you possibly have success elsewhere in this truly existential battle? And I will say that at my university, the top diversity officer, the highest person in charge at my university of discrimination, is a woman by the name of Sally Abdallah. Now, Sally Abdallah, if you've not heard of her name, you should know her name. She is the former director of Cary, Minnesota. Now, Cary might scare you right away, but let me scare you even more. Cary, Minnesota is one of the most extreme chapters of Cary. In fact, Cary Central has distanced itself from Cary, Minnesota because of their extremism. And Sally Abdallah, who was the civil rights director of that chapter of Cary, is today the highest level ranking officer in charge of discrimination, including anti-Semitism, which means that a Cary director, who, by the way, also led the BDS movement there, is in charge of investigating anti-Semitism claims at my university. So when Jews tell you that they're scared, when students tell you that they're scared to come forward, this is why. What hope does a student have for successfully prosecuting a discrimination case? What hope do they even have to come forward to begin with? Like, what would give you any confidence at all that your case is going to be investigated fairly and justly and equitably if the head of discrimination at your university is an anti-Zionist, an avowed anti-Zionist, someone who has led the BDS movement, someone who's been a director at the most extreme care, arguably, in the United States? And just to show you that it's not just hypothetical, this director of discrimination, this chief diversity officer, has put a policy called the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism onto our discrimination page. So if you go to CUNY's discrimination page, you will see the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism on there. Now, a lot of people watching this will have never heard of that because you're good people. Good people tend to not have heard of this definition of anti-Semitism. It was drafted in part by Peter Beinart. It is endorsed by Cary. So now you already know a lot more about it, right? Just by those two pieces of information. That's probably all I need to say. It is an anti-Semitic definition of anti-Semitism, and it was created for the sole purpose of undermining the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And what it does is it allows the university to declare Zionist Jews as racists. And so at my university now, there are 4 Zionist Jewish faculty members who filed anti-Semitism complaints, but because those anti-Semitism complaints were based on things like BDS or radical Islamic anti-Semitism, they were placed under investigation because of this definition. They were actually investigating for filing the wrong kind of complaints against anti-Semitism. One of those 4 people was me. I was recently exonerated because I was lucky enough to have CUNY want to get me so badly, because they despised that I'm revealing all this stuff to the world, that they hired a multi-million-dollar multinational firm called Stone Turn to investigate me. And luckily for me, Stone Turn had some honorable, ethical stances and ethos. And when they looked at the facts, they couldn't believe it. And they fully exonerated me across the board. But the fact that I had to go through that is the problem. It's outrageous. And there are other Zionist Jews still under investigation, again, for filing anti-Semitism complaints. That's what they did wrong. So I'm sorry if that's a depressing introduction, but that's how bad it is at CUNY. And that's why we are here fighting it.
Thank you. I think we knew it was bad, but you do make it sound pretty terrible. And I'm glad you've been exonerated, and wish the best for the others.
Yes.
So, Cary, you want to tell us a little bit what's happening in Canada and how we can understand the fact that this is university, supposedly intellectual individuals carrying this out?
Well, first of all, I thank you so much for the invitation, for allowing me to be here with you, and thanks to Andrea and to CAEF for putting on this program. I'm quite shocked to hear Jeff's story. It's the first time I'm actually hearing Jeff's story. So as the instinct in me as a psychologist will be to say, I'm very sorry to hear that that's everything that you've been going through, because it's terrible and unacceptable. In some ways is very extreme, but it doesn't surprise me from the stories I'm hearing from faculty members. I came into this discussion about 2 or 3 years ago, and I have to say, I was hired on a campus that is actually relatively, in a city where there's a relatively small population of Jewish people, so very different kind of demographic. Where I was hired, to do a job in clinical psychology, and not to talk about anti-Semitism. That wasn't my area of expertise. I remember the first week on campus in 2005, walking on campus and seeing the Israel Apartheid Week being held, and sort of walking by it and being curious about that, and not thinking much about it. Since that time, which is a number of years ago, things have actually deteriorated significantly. So about 2 years ago, our campus faculty union passed a motion against the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. Was exactly what Jeff was talking about, the IRA definition. And this is the consensus definition based on human rights law. It's the accepted definition. It contains a number of examples. It clearly states that criticism of Israel should not be considered anti-Semitism. It provides a number of very specific ways of thinking about context and actually using the definition in a non-legally binding way. And so our faculty union took it upon themselves, without being asked to even adopt the definition, right? They took it upon themselves to actually pass a resolution that included language about Israel that was a dog whistle to those who understood how to decode what was said, essentially stating that the IRA definition is a threat to academic freedom, and specifically a threat to being able to study decolonization and to study racism. And what that means, to decode it for those who might not appreciate that, what that is saying is that Israel is a racist and colonial state, because it's saying that this definition prevents you from making those, for engaging in that kind of scholarship. So nobody asked them to pass that resolution. They passed it on their own. And this really was the inspiration for me to understand what was going on our campuses and to look further. And as I looked further, I realized that there were many faculty members who were going about their business in their various disciplines, studying what they're studying, engaging in research, teaching, and noticing that there had been this shift on campus that I think came to a peak in May 2021, when there was the previous Hamas-Israel conflict, where the discourse on campus, particularly coming from unions, both student unions and faculty unions, but also coming from fellow faculty and students, had just the discourse had really coarsened enormously. And there was really no place for faculty to connect, unlike the trope that all Jews know each other and there's, a cabal of Jews controlling things. I barely knew another Jewish faculty member on my campus. So it inspired me to think about how we could build a network, both to support each other as we were noticing these changes that were happening on our campuses, and that's what the Network for Engaged Canadian Academics is. I want to talk about why what we're seeing is happening. I think there are some roots that we need to address, and this has been a long time in the making. I think, Jeff, you talked about a number of years of systematically removing Jewish people from leadership positions at your university. But what animates these kinds of sentiments? So there are a few things going on here, and I think we need to understand that the current ideas around EDI are actually informed by an anti-oppression framework, which is, fundamentally something that, Andrew, you talked about, this idea that there are people who are oppressed and people who are oppressors. And essentially the world has to be divided in this way. And in order for us to, resolve injustices in our societies, we need to deal with this imbalance between the oppressed and the oppressors. And so the idea is that we blame the system. There's a systemic bias against people of color, Black people. And this is also informed by critical race theory, which had a very, very specific function to understand what was going on in the US legal system. Now that idea of this binary between oppressed and oppressor, what is proposed is that the way to understand whether a system is biased is to look at outcomes and only look at outcomes, and to say that certain groups are benefiting from a system of oppression more than other groups. So what happens to Jewish people in the system? Of course, Jewish people traditionally have done well through merit and through effort. So if they are doing better than other groups, then it must be because they are part of a system of oppression. And that gets applied to Jewish people, but it also gets applied to states like Israel. So Israel is an oppressive state. It must be an oppressive state. And further adding to that is this idea of post-colonialism, that Israel is essentially a nation of white people who have taken over from Palestinian people who are framed as oppressed people, who should be understood as part of people of color, and this idea is overgeneralized to the extent where now we have this very simplistic way of understanding, and it becomes very easy to introduce existing conspiracy theory and tropes onto that theory. So to say now, well, Jews are controlling the banks, Jews are controlling the world. So this has now infected the way of understanding things to the degree where there really is no other theory that is being proposed. So you have a single theory that's informing a lot of the humanities for the last 25 years, which is being adopted by and actually adopted by our equality, diversity, and inclusion offices as the theory to use to understand why certain groups are experiencing discrimination and hatred, rather than our understanding of what is actually happening, which is people hate other people and people, exhibit hatred towards other people. It's not about privilege and power. It may be in certain circumstances, and that may be one factor to understand it, but it isn't the whole picture. And I think it's been overgeneralized, and because it is informing the EDI or DEI ways of thinking about things, Jews are disadvantaged in that. They don't fit naturally into an oppressor-oppressed category. And so they have been shoehorned into the oppressor category, and now actually are an easy target. So so unions in Canada, what has happened is essentially they have been informed by these ideas. We have unions passing these anti-IRA motions, which disadvantage Jewish people. We have student unions who are passing motions that are calling Israel a genocidal state that engages in ethnic cleansing. And of course, when you think about students at this age, this very important developmental stage where they're, where they're most flexible in their thinking about morality and ideas and how they're forming their opinions about society. If you think about it, it is, in fact, it makes a lot of sense to choose universities as the place to push these ideas. And in fact, what we're seeing is that people are taking advantage of the anti-oppressive framework intentionally to influence the future minds. And these are our future thought leaders who are being formed, in whether it's professional schools of medicine or psychology or social work or law. So these are our future thought leaders who are being influenced by these ideas, and I would say intentionally. And so, of course, if you're taught these ideas and you incorporate this framework into the way of looking at the world, then you see yourself as doing, the positive work of social justice. And so you feel like you're on the right side of society. And so, Israel is an oppressor state. So, if we, to quote a writer, Cary Nelson, he says, "We generally accept that fierce accusations against the Jewish state should not be used as weapons against individual students and faculty, and yet they routinely are. If Zionism is racism, then every Zionist is a racist, and harassment on that basis actually can seem virtuous and ennobling." And so that's quite insidious when you think about it. You're actually incorporating this ideology, believing that you're doing the work of social justice, and yet in and of itself, you're actually, I would say, engaging in anti-Semitism. I would also just to come back to what else is happening on campuses in Canada. We need to recognize that campuses, in addition to being the place where students are, forming their ideas about the world, there's also a particular type of climate where we have academic freedom. And what we're seeing is that academic freedom is actually being used by professors as a bludgeon, is actually being used to promote anti-Semitic ideas. It's being used as a veil to protect people from speech that really can be considered inciting hatred, discriminatory speech. So we need to make an important point about academic freedom, which is that we have this protected speech, and it's really meant to protect faculty from the university or governments from being able to be able to explore any kind of topic they want to do in sort of a free environment. It's not intended to provide people with a platform to spew hate and incite hatred and discriminate or intimidate students. And what we're seeing is that people are using academic freedom and hiding behind academic freedom to promote all sorts of ideologies that are problematic. So what I would say, though, is we have taken a position that, professors can say what they want in the classroom, and they certainly have their academic freedom to do that, but it must be concordant with the actual topic of that, the subject matter of that class. If it goes outside of that, and we've seen that a few cases of that very recently, where students are being subjected to anti-Israel rhetoric, anti-Semitic rhetoric in the classroom in subjects that have nothing to do with political science or conflict studies. So that's a huge problem, and I think we need to address that. We probably talk about solutions in a little bit, but that's an issue. And what we have seen is that people who are even in courses where it's relevant to talk about these things, they are using texts that are highly problematic. For example, the work of Jasper Puar, who asserts that the IDF steals organs from Palestinian children and sells them on the black market. And this is an award-winning book published by Duke University Press, and talks about how the IDF intentionally maims children so that they will be disabled for their lives and obviously not be able to fight in the resistance. So that's being taught in our courses. And what we would say as an organization, that really protects academic freedom, is that teaching that kind of material in class is obviously highly offensive. A professor may have a right to do that, but we have a right as professors to actually ask our deans and chairs to review syllabi that contain these kinds of books and push back on bad scholarship and call it out when it happens, and be able to say to other faculty members why this is bad scholarship and why this is problematic. So we would take the approach of addressing bad speech with good speech. So I think I'll stop there, and that's a lot to process, and we'll continue our discussion.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move some of what you said to a question for Jeff, because I'm quite familiar, and as I'm sure most of our audience is, with the argument that free speech enables you to have bad speech, even prejudicial speech, but that there should be a line somewhere. So my question is really, do facts matter? You just gave examples of someone who's spewed a bunch of lies. Not only is the topic not relevant to some courses, but what about holding people to the fact that you're at a university and facts, investigation, research, evidence should matter? And it would appear that it never does.
That's an excellent question. And let me combine it with, I'd like to just respond really quickly to one thing that Dr. Kogan said. And he articulated the oppressor versus the oppressed so exceptionally well. I definitely could not have said it better myself. But one thing I would like to push back on a little bit is that he said you can't easily place Jews into the oppressor or oppressed category. I would argue there is no more oppressed group in the history of the world than Jewish people. So I think it's very easy to place Jewish people in the oppressed category. And I would also say that by definition, all white people are white. Not all Jewish people are white. So to put us in a white category, before it was politically or, in this argumentatively convenient for me, even as a child, I never viewed myself as a white person because my grandparents were Holocaust survivors and my great-grandparents were gassed in gas chambers by white supremacists. And because I was beaten up by a white kid on my block almost on a daily basis, walking home from my bus stop because I was the Jew and he was white. So I've never seen myself as white, truly and honestly. Whenever I have a checkbox form on an application that says, check off white, Asian American, whatever, I don't feel comfortable checking anything on there. I don't view myself as white. I never have. It's not a joke. I really don't see myself as white. I've never been treated as white by anybody, by any white group. So I would just say that Jews are the most oppressed. Obviously, you put slavery in there too. That was awful. But if you're talking about throughout human history, I'm not comparing the levels of horrors. You don't need to compare the Holocaust with slavery. It's not necessary. They're both unbelievably evil things. But I definitely think Jews are in the oppressed category. To answer your question more directly, such a phenomenal question. And I'm sure Dr. Kogan will respond with what I have to say, and I look forward to hearing it. To answer more directly what you were asking about, Andrea, such a phenomenal question. And it really boils down to what Dr. Kogan started to talk about, which is holding professors or student groups accountable for the things that they do that are not protected by free speech. Now, I know Canada does not have a First Amendment like the United States does, so the laws are a little different. I'm not sure what the breakdown of your audience is here. I suspect it's mostly Canadian. But let me talk a little bit about what the laws are in the United States and how you should not be using. And I want to refer people to a phenomenal article that was written by Mark Goldfeder, one of the most brilliant attorneys I know fighting this issue in the United States and fighting for legislation to protect Jews, anti-BDS legislation, pro-IRA definition legislation. And he talks about how campuses right now in the United States are acting the way Dr. Kogan explained, cowardly. And that's how I would describe it, because they are using a Supreme Court case called Brandenburg, which talks about incitement to violence as the exception for free speech, that, you know, you're allowed to have free speech. It can't be criminalized by the government. People don't really, you know, the average person thinks free speech means restrictions on speech. No, it just means it can't be criminalized by the government. And we're talking about only public universities here. But the Brandenburg case said that for something to be incitement to violence, which is an exception to free speech, there has to be an imminent danger of harm and a likelihood of that harm. So that's a very high standard, and that's why a lot of people use this standard, because it's very hard to overcome. But in the campus, now you addressed this, Andrea, and I was so glad you did, because it really leads right into a great answer to that question. Campuses have a very strong exception to the free speech standard. And that is exactly what both of you started to talk about, which is that you have an obligation on a campus to further an environment of learning, to further an environment of, you know, all ideas being set forth. And so if there is anything that is happening on that campus, there was another famous Supreme Court case called Tinker, which Dr. Goldfeder talks about so eloquently in his article, that where the Supreme Court of the United States found that the Constitution does not allow for schools to shut down speech that will, quote, materially and substantially interfere with the requirements of appropriate discipline in the operation of the school or invades the rights of others. That's the standard that schools need to use. It is not the Brandenburg free speech standard of incitement to violence. Schools have an obligation to keep an open academic environment of learning and open ideas and free exchange of ideas, and they have an obligation to protect that, and that is not protected by the First Amendment. So if SJP is causing an environment on a campus at a public university in the United States, you do not have an obligation to allow that speech if it's going to interfere with the learning environment for students. And it's a different standard than what the nefarious other side is putting out there, which is the Brandenburg incitement to violence standard. But I would point out one, and I'll move on after this and let Dr. Kogan speak. But I would put out one more thing out there. The idea that the incitement to violence standard has not been reached multiple times with the language Dr. Kogan was referring to, like intifada and from the river to the sea, that is laughably ridiculous. There are free speech extremists out there in the United States, even on our side, who say, well, as much as I hate it, I have to allow it. Now, I'm a huge free speech proponent. I agree that Nazis should be allowed to speak. I want to counter that with more speech by showing how ignorant they are, how evil they are, by opposing them. However, the incitement to violence standard has been breached many times in the United States, even in just the past few weeks or months. Paul Kessler was just killed after speech similar to the, you know, from the river to the sea and intifada. I forgot what the exact term was, but it was one of those. And a Palestinian activist, a pro-Hamas activist, I would say, took a megaphone and smashed his head in and murdered him. So obviously that type of speech leads to, and that's just one example, Joey Borgen was injured after that kind of speech at a rally in New York City. Matt Greenman was injured and I believe hospitalized after that type of language by a group called Within Our Lifetime in the United States. On my campus alone, there was a student who went out there with a baseball bat, started yelling, kill all Jews, free Palestine, and beat up a kid with the bat, yelling those terms. So I just gave you 4 examples of that extremist terminology being used and Jews being injured or killed. So I would argue that the incitement to violence standard is invoked by that language. We've seen it countless times. How many Jews have to be injured or killed before we connect the language of globalize the intifada, which means injure Jews everywhere, and from the river to the sea and intifada in general? How many times do we have to see a Jew be injured before we say, oh yeah, it is very likely to incite violence. That is very likely to result in a harm to a Jewish person. So I believe even the highest standard has been met. But I would say, to close here, that on the university campuses, if it gives presidents a little more strength to not be cowards, you don't even need to get to incitement to violence. All you have to do is follow the Supreme Court law that requires you to protect the free exchange of academic ideas on your campus.
Thank you. We're not seeing that free exchange, right, Cary? But we're also not seeing much by way of administrators taking a position.
No, I mean, we saw that right after October 7th, where, university presidents and leaders were, drawing a moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel's response to a terror attack, where it was sort of a both sides-ism, expression, where people, university leaders are hiding under their desks because they're so afraid that, of doing the right thing and offending, special interest groups on campus who don't agree that Israel has a right to exist. So that's definitely the case. I do want to respond to Jeff's point about the oppressor-oppressed thing. I absolutely agree with Jeff that I think Jews have a long and storied history of oppression. What I meant was that the framework itself doesn't allow Jews to be understood. And I think what ends up happening is that because of that, we are thrown in because we do generally better given our, overall, if you look, at our history in North America and the United States and Canada, that it doesn't fit with the model, which is that somehow if there are differences in outcome, then that's proof that there's systemic racism. And I think that's where the model breaks down. So I absolutely agree with you. And I would actually say that we should probably throw out this is a theory. Remember, it's critical race theory. That this theory, we have to look at what context does it function. To me as a scientist, when the data doesn't support the theory, which is what I would argue is going on here, we need to update the theory or figure out in which ways the theory applies and doesn't apply. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that there's a winnowing of diversity, less and less diversity around this issue, and there's essentially one viewpoint that is the only viewpoint that you can have. And again, it's that viewpoint that animates these EDI discussions. So I think that's a problem. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to the legal issues, but what I can say in Canada is we have hate speech laws. We don't have the First Amendment. We don't have the Civil Rights Act, which has been used, in Title VI, I guess, complaints against universities. That hasn't happened here. And actually, this is a matter, that we're our group and with other lawyers in Canada, we're trying to figure out what are the limits of academic freedom in Canada. I would argue that, Palestine is free from the river to the sea is something that can be discussed in the context of a course. At my university, we had this long discussion about whether the N-word could be used in class. And I think context matters, right? So if we're having a discussion about the history of the expression, Palestine should be free from the river to the sea, that's very different than somebody with a baseball bat in the quad, screaming it and inciting violence. So I think that's there are some differences there, and I think the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition actually addresses how we can look at these two situations: the classroom discussing what it means and what its implications are, versus it being yelled out towards students in a violent way. But that hasn't really been resolved in my as far as we can tell here. It hasn't been a Supreme Court ruling here on academic freedom that I think in the same way that you're talking about in the United States, and it's sorely needed. Clearly, when people are engaging in academic malpractice, they need to be called out. When people are using academic freedom as a shield to promote or promulgate anti-Semitic ideology, that needs to be stopped. We had a student who talked about in her course being assigned a reading. I don't remember which book it was, but a reading that essentially said the Jews control the banks. And she had to read that, not critically, but had to read it as if it were fact. In my mind, that's a human rights violation, and that should have been the basis of a complaint to the Human Rights Office because it's unacceptable. So we still have to test this.
It does put us in the position of having to bring complaints on a continuous basis because no one is dealing with the overall systemic issue here of anti-Semitism, correct? So you raised something very important there, Cary. You point out the failure of critical race theory to really deal with fact. And the question I asked earlier, really, doesn't it come down to the need for us to toss out critical race theory altogether? It's biased. And in fact, I shouldn't use that expression, but an important fact that's missed is that the people with the highest income, according to the data I have read recently in North America, are not white people of privilege or Jews, but brown people or people of Asian background. If you look at the data on people from Southeast Asia and Far East, Korea, Japan, China, the students and the graduates and those with those kinds of backgrounds do far better now than the Caucasian population in terms of income, which is a measure of outcome of your education and your status in society. So nobody is blasting people for having a high income because they're brown, but only if you're white.
So I mean, I would push back a little bit about, it is a theory. I mean, the question, it's an empirical question you're asking, right? So the theory needs to be tested, and it has to be tested in a way that allows us to draw some conclusions. And I don't think that it's been adequately tested. And I think, unfortunately, it's been fast-tracked, right, from a theory to a practice. That's the issue. So I wouldn't say we throw it out. I would say, okay, it's one theory, and that's one way to understand how there may be forms of oppression. But we can't exclude these other factors or explanations or theories that might help us understand what's going on better.
But Cary, do we need to really understand the world in terms of an oppression paradigm? Because that's how it's described. We have people, and we've done research in social work here, as you know, and we've been told by faculty that the new framework for understanding every human problem, the social work world, is through an oppression framework.
It's a problem because that's the practice of critical race theory.
There's nobody holding anybody responsible for their own life.
Yeah. Well, we need to this has been going on for 25 years, right? We've hired people that study this theory. We have now, if we're talking about academic freedom, do we really have academic freedom if everyone thinks the same thing? There is no open exchange of ideas if everybody has the same idea. So I agree with you. We need to introduce and accept that there are other ways of looking at this and see to what extent might that framework explain something. Maybe it's minimal, maybe it's 5%, but it's being sold as 100%. And I think that's the issue.
I want to get back to what Jeff said about the administrator he's dealing with, the administration, a whole horde of people who don't like Jews, I guess. What's the role of the president overall in setting the tone? We say in the corporate world, and I ran a very, very large organization one time, that an organization starts with the tone at the top. So you can't expect better behavior from your employees if you, as the top dog, don't set the tone. And literally a philosophy of behavior, a vision for the organization, understandable and shared objectives. Do you think that the universities are as rotten as they are today because that many university presidents don't care, or they carry an anti-Semitic life's view?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on there. Number one, under the oppressor-oppressed DEI / critical theory rubric, under all those rubrics, the universities are making a very methodical effort to hire the top leaders who will enforce those same rubrics. And that's why it's happening. And so you're not getting university leaders anymore, almost anywhere, who have the traditional view of diversity. I mean, when I was a kid, and I think I'm probably a little older than Dr. Kogan, but when I was a kid, and I'm sure when he was, diversity meant something very different than what is meant by diversity today. Diversity today is discriminatory by definition, because it really truly does discriminate against Jews, for sure. I'm seeing it firsthand, against white people. And that is discriminatory under American law. And I'm not a lawyer in Canada, so I don't want to speak to that, but I'm sure it's kind of similar, the laws on discrimination. You can't discriminate based on skin color. You can't hire based on skin color. That's not a characteristic you're allowed to use. So one answer to your question is, I think there's three different answers to your question, Andrea. And one is that the universities are specifically making an effort to hire leaders, presidents, and the chancellor, at least in my university and universities that are large, who will enforce this oppressor-oppressed rubric, a critical theory rubric, and what really is a Marxist rubric, which I hope we'll get into a little bit later in the discussion. It's very much based on Marxism. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is there's a lot of pressure, real pressure on university leaders, and not just university leaders, any leaders in society today, anybody with a position where they have a very high income, they have a high-level job, they're a VP at a big corporation, they're making a lot of money, they are under tremendous pressure either to at least hide their true views on these topics or to conform with the orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy today has become what the minority are yelling the most loudly about, that you see in the streets every day with these riots. I'm not going to call them rallies, because really they're riots for the most part. What's happening? They're vandalizing buildings, they're hurting people, and they're threatening people. Those are not rallies, those are riots. And so there's a lot of pressure not to be a victim of the next riot, not to be a victim of, I hate this term, but cancel culture, not to lose what you have by going along with the minority opinion, even though it's right. And I say this to young people, especially today, students today, please stand by your ideals. Please don't be scared to speak up and say what you believe. And I would never advocate somebody getting into a situation that might cause them physical danger. I don't want to do that. But if our society is to survive, if Jews are to survive, seriously, I really truly believe that the existential nature of our existence is at play here. We need brave people to stand up. And I have to say, since October 7th, I'm seeing it more than ever, which makes me, you hate to say something good came out of something so horribly evil and horrifying, but I do see more people speaking up than ever before, because I think people are starting to realize that was things that were hidden before are now, plainly out in the open, that a clear line has been drawn between good and evil. So I think there's a lot of pressure on people to conform to these views that Dr. Kogan expressed so well. And I think that society is set up now in a way with the DEI initiatives, which he also addressed well, so I don't need to hire those types of people. And then the third category that responds to your question, Andrea, is, I hate to say it, there just is a lot of anti-Semitism out there. There just simply are a lot of people who don't like Jews. Look at the recent comments by people all over the spectrum, in the mainstream, that have said things that were so outrageously anti-Semitic. Actors, celebrities. There are countless examples. And why are they doing that? Because they don't like Jews. And I think that's been exposed more than ever. And the greatest proof of that is, and I pray that the history books will clearly show and document that before one single bullet was fired into Gaza, Israel was being attacked and Hamas was being defended for raping women, for beheading children. Think of that if you're a parent. Think of that if you're not a parent. Setting kids on fire. That was before Israel fired one bullet into Gaza. So the line is, what is that? So previously we've been told our problem is with the Israeli government and their policy. We're not anti-Semites. We have no problem with Jews. But that was all thrown in the garbage on October 7th. On October 8th, everyone woke up and knew that that was garbage, that these people have a problem with Jews just being there and with Jews being pretty much anywhere they don't want Jews to be. That's what their real problem is. So those are the three answers, I think, to your question.
Thank you. And I suspect there's a huge percentage of those people who've never met a Jew. That would be true in Canada because we're a tiny, tiny number. If you're less than 1% of the population, what's the chance that people have run into a Jew? Not likely. I think a lot of it's foreign influence, right? We don't have time to talk today about the Islamist influence. I think some people would like to hear a little bit about solutions. So I want to move to that. with apologies because there is so much to cover. Cary, you will have noticed that in the University of Alberta, a woman who was the director of the Sexual Assault Center said Hamas didn't rape Jewish women. She was fired immediately. Is that what we need to see more of? Do you think faculty members that are exhilarated about the Hamas resistance should be fired?
Well, so I think we need to make a distinction. She was a director of a center, so she's in a leadership position. She has no business making that kind of statement, and I think that was the appropriate thing, was to terminate her position. I mean, that's totally unacceptable. Now, when it comes to faculty members who are engaging in we've seen, for example, leadership at faculty unions make statements. They've had to retract them, and now there are actually there are legal proceedings against those people. I think that's the right way to approach it. Now, if people are asserting their academic freedom, then that's where we're talking about, where is that bright line? There is no bright line right now in Canada anyway around between what people are asserting as their academic freedom and what is hate speech. I think that needs to be resolved. I wish I had a clear answer for you. Should people lose their positions or their faculty positions because they're making these statements? I think we have to look at it at a case-by-case basis. What's being said, in what context, who's affected by it. I am very worried about our Jewish students who have been hiding their Jewish identities for the past several years, hiding their Magen Davids, taking off their kippas. I mean, that is, to me, a climate that is unsustainable. You cannot have a campus that does not welcome its Jewish students. And if faculty are producing an unsafe environment, that needs to be addressed by leadership, for sure. I think there are other solutions I'm happy to talk about. I mean, we have a number of things a number of quick things that I could point out that are immediate, and some are longer term solutions.
Okay, if you could, and one of the things I wanted to point out that I read that sounded positive, if maybe it's a threat to freedom, I don't know, or freedom of expression. 2 or 3 universities in the US literally put their Students for Justice in Palestine organizations on hold. We have organizations with a similar but slightly different name here in Canada, one of which just ran a motion through McGill University, basically condemning Israel, and called for a full university student vote on it. And
that was a student union, actually, so yeah. not a student group. That's right. And so they have different roles and different requirements, and I think it's outrageous, and that there should be a consequence to that, because it's clearly discriminatory language that was included in that motion. I read the full motion. It's unacceptable.
We have Students for Justice in Palestine organizations called something about human rights, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But they're all campaigning right now or protesting any support for Israel. Should they be suspended, as was the situation in the US?
Well, I think that the Students for Justice in Palestine, and actually I think it was Jewish Voices for Peace, that it was the 2 of them lost their standing at Columbia University, and I think at Brandeis, and I think they essentially were breaking the code of conduct rules, and so that was the consequence. And I think often that was my first point to make about solutions, is you need to hold people accountable according to the existing policies at your institution. We've seen over and over again where policies are not being equitably applied when it comes to Jewish people. We've seen, for example, one university where there was a clearly anti-Semitic poster that was displayed, and it was treated as poor student conduct. It was not treated as an incident of anti-Semitism. So, they took the poster down, and, the student, I don't know what the consequence was for the student, but it was not a serious consequence. It needs to be understood as a hate crime, right? So that there isn't a good enforcement or accountability. So I think that's one thing immediately that we need to ask our universities to apply their existing policies. And there are plenty of them that don't have to talk about anti-Semitism, but talk about harassment, bullying, and discrimination. And those need to be used.
And those haven't been. So bearing that in mind, and maybe this is the last question given the time, isn't it true that boards of governors need to hold the presidents accountable? I'm not hearing anything about the role of the boards of governors, and I can tell you that CAEF has on 3 occasions written to every single governor of the University of Toronto about what's going on there, and we've been completely ignored. And I discovered that the president himself chairs those meetings, and we know he's not responsive, and so I'm not sure how you break through.
I know how to break through. You're absolutely right. I mean, I don't know how it works in the US, but yes, we have board of governors, and the board, can very easily, you can find a member of the board of governors who is able to introduce a motion for discussion. And that can include, talking about a strategy to deal with anti-Semitism on campus, ultimately they are responsible for determining whether the president keeps his or her job. So that is the accountability to the president. I don't want to paint every campus with the same brush, because there are presidents that have done the right thing on Canadian campuses. But to your point, I do think that boards can be quite effective as long as you have at least one member who understands the issues, Jewish or not Jewish, it doesn't really matter, who can actually raise the issue and hold the university presidents responsible.
So I expect, Jeff, that might not be true at CUNY, where they may love their current president, who's filled the ranks at the top with people like herself.
Yeah, well, the CUNY has a board of trustees. And again, they're subject to the very same influences as everybody else in society, and the same, all the same problems that I spoke about in response to your last question apply to them. First of all, their ideology is very much within the oppressor context that Dr. Kogan spoke about. That's number one. Number two, really the strongest voice is the Board of Trustees chair, who at CUNY is Bill Thompson, who has done absolutely nothing. And again, they don't want to upset the apple cart. They understand that the demographics have changed dramatically in the United States. And that's a very important part of this. What's happening now could never have happened 20 years ago. It's not possible, because the demographics in the country have changed so immensely in the United States. And I remember seeing a stat a number of years ago that within 25 years, Muslims and Arabs are going to outnumber Jews in the United States by some significant amount, because historically Jews have outnumbered Arabs in the United States. That has shifted dramatically. And don't misunderstand me. I know the last thing on earth is that I want, given the scrutiny that I'm under, is to be misquoted. The vast majority of Muslim and Arab people are great people, all right? All they want is to live a safe life with their families, free of war, free of conflict, and free of hate. I truly do believe that. However, the problem is there is a small percentage that don't want that. They don't want to assimilate to American culture, which is very important when you come here. Because if you're not assimilating to American culture and you're actually fighting American and Western culture, you're doing tremendous damage to the country. And what I see it's very interesting and it's very horrifying. A lot of people that are coming here with, the U.S. border crisis has been well documented, I think, globally lately. And what I see happening firsthand is, because when students first come to our country and they enter our campus, we see them very often right when they're getting here, basically, very soon afterwards. And they, from a lot of countries, they're being taught anti-Semitism from the youngest possible age. They're coming in here with a preordained ideology to hate Jews. And so the problem is there is a percentage that when you have so many people coming from certain regions, that they're going to have a bias or a hate for Jews just inherent. And that's what we're seeing happen. We're seeing that small percentage. Really important to realize that these people yelling and screaming in the streets, these horrible threats towards Jews, are the minority. It's not most people. The overwhelming majority of students, all they want is to get their degree, get a good job, and have a nice life. Very important to understand that's still the case. That's all that they want. But When you have an overwhelming majority of people coming from certain regions where they are taught from the youngest age that Jews are the most evil thing that ever existed on planet Earth, you're going to have a problem. And that's what we're seeing happening.
That's exactly what's happening here in Canada. Just say, by the way, our demographic has also shifted, and there are 5 times the number of Muslims per capita in Canada as the US. So, and it's that small percentage of people exactly who are bad actors. I agree.
We need to carry on this discussion and deal with that one quite separately. I think it's very important. I think people are afraid to talk about it because you'll be branded racist, Islamophobic, and anti-Muslim and all kinds of other things. So in many ways, we duck it. We need to talk about it. I want to thank both of you very, very much for participating today, and thank all the people who did sign on. We had 200 and some people at one point there, and I've tried to capture some of the questions. What I will do is they'll all be copied and I'll sort through them. And Jeff and Cary, if you're willing, I will forward some individual questions and then we'll publish the responses. I think people would appreciate that. We're obviously going to be dealing with this for some time. I think, Jeff, at the beginning, you said it took generations to get where we were, decades at least, and it may take us that long to unwind it. So thank you for putting us on the road to thinking about it and some things we can actually do. Stay strong, stay proud, be loud, right? We are proudful Jews. Have a good day. Again, thank you to our many co-sponsors. We very much appreciate your support.